Okay, so kick things off. We're here at this conference. You've just spoken and had a nice personal discussion and a panel discussion. What do you think of the conference here, of the value of conferences here in general, and the value of conferences in the crypto space as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because this is such a diverse community spread out across the entire world. I find the conferences are helpful for me because you lose so much when you're just talking to people, in text on the internet. You lose a lot of context, you lose a lot of cultural differences, and coming together once in a while to get that real face-to-face, to really see people and oftentimes to be able to better overcome conflicts from online communication is very important. And really just the fact that this ecosystem is bringing together people from so many different nations, so many different backgrounds, I think is an amazing facet, which makes me even more hopeful for the fact that we can build something that really is a global financial system.
Also, we need to get an update on the state of your beard. I mean, last I understood you had the full beard. Now you've shaved it off. We need to see these updates in real time.
Yeah, it's operational security, right? So anyone who's been following along my sort of OPSEC changes would notice that one thing that I talked about is blending into the crowd. Mm-hmm. And so I try not to do anything too flashy or outrageous these days.
Okay, so without the beard, that's the keeping things astute and hidden. Now, you have an interesting personal history when it comes to cryptosphere as a whole, Bitcoin obviously particularly as a focus. You've done some interesting moves living off the grid, sort of a focus of your interests so far. Talk to us a little bit about your personal philosophy when it comes to decentralization, blockchain technology as a whole, and how you factor that into your daily life.
Well, the first thing is that I think this is all still an experiment, and I even treat my own life as an experiment. What basically happened to me 2 years ago with having police show up and shutting down my whole neighborhood, that was a learning experience, and I chose to turn that into another learning experience to see how far I could push the boundaries of personal privacy while still doing things like this, while still, using my reputation in a variety of ways to move around through the community, speak to people, try to help build the ecosystem out. As you say, going off the grid, if I really had gone off the grid completely, it would have been so much easier. But while still trying to maintain a presence, but keep a level of privacy that can keep me from having security incidents again. That's the real fun and challenging part. And so I kind of apply that mindset to everything in this space, where what I've been focused on for the past year with Lightning Network stuff, same thing. It's still very experimental, but that just means that there's a lot of opportunity, and we're able to get this sort of niche following, the really hardcore folks who are willing to take risks and experiment and basically build platforms, build companies off of our efforts and their efforts, and just continue to drive this whole system forward by failing. You fail, you find what doesn't work, you try something else, and you just keep going.
I'd say that personal philosophy and that philosophy you just espoused of sort of privacy, decentralization, moving away from those power structures, but while still maintaining, as you say, not totally off the grid. You still have to be functional. You still have to be able to live your life, as it were. It's sort of built into the ethos, particularly of early cryptocurrencies. But do you think that perhaps those who've gotten into the sphere later, let's even say in or post the 2017 boom, do you think that some of that has been watered down and lost from the crypto sphere as a whole, or are we still able to maintain that true to form original ethos?
I think that is going to be one of the big questions of what is going to change long term. We've already seen a couple of what you could call classes or generations of crypto adopters. I would say that the earliest class of adopters were the cypherpunks, the cryptology folks, who they just thought it was an interesting project and it was probably going to fail. Then, once like the Silk Road came around, you saw a lot of libertarians and anarchists and people who wanted to drive like black markets forward. That was going for a couple of years until we started to get more mainstream in the investor side of things, when people started to try to look forward and see how can this technology get used over the long run. I think I'm going to invest a lot in it now because I expect a huge return will happen. Then the real question is, when does the actual mainstream adoption happen? Has it already happened? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years from now? And when it does happen, will the perspectives of those people drown out and overwhelm the previous generations, or will some kernel of those perspectives continue to drive forward? And I am certainly of the earlier mindset where I got into it from a very ideological perspective of freedom and privacy and security. And so that's one of the reasons why I still stick around and try to be prominent, is I want to continue to keep some of those things in the public conversation.
So an interesting point you just raised, you said, talking on mass adoption, when it happens. Do you believe it's an inevitability?
There is a mindset that I ascribe to, which is that if this system doesn't fail, then it's going to succeed immensely. There's a big question around how long that's going to take. It's not going to happen next year, probably not going to happen in a few years. This may very well be a generational thing. I am in this for the long term. I want to build a system that will outlast every other fiat currency, which means it needs to last for generations and generations.
Now, speaking of lasting, developing, building an ecosystem, now you come from this from the early perspective as a Bitcoin engineer and coming from that really Bitcoin-centric perspective. Bitcoin, altcoin fights and debates raging all across the crypto sphere at the moment. What's your take on it, and do you think it's healthy or detrimental to the industry?
I think all experimentation is healthy. The question of which things are scams and which are not becomes a big gray area, because a lot of it, I think, comes down to what is the actual perspective of the person who is pushing a particular new network, and you can't really know. And in some cases, some people may be scamming themselves. There are even a lot of, I guess, real-world analogies. You can make similar type of claims about some companies out there that were pushing products that even the founders of the companies thought, we're going to make it, we're going to be able to actually meet these claims, but then they failed. And maybe they were scamming themselves, and they unintentionally scammed a lot of other people. And the same thing can happen in the crypto space. There have only been a handful of scams that are just so blatant and obvious that that the people behind them are obviously trying to delude people.
It's a tough game to work out. But then, all right, so speaking of projects and moving forward and sort of building a more positive space, what are you working on right now?
So for the past 5 years, I've been working on pretty boring private key security stuff. First at BitGo, now at Casa, basically trying to help people empower themselves, try to make self-custody really reachable for average human beings. And that is something that I still think is not a fully solved problem, and it is sort of integral to the whole mindset of personal sovereignty in this space. If we want to avoid getting back into a system where the majority of wealth is being held by custodians who then will have a lot of power over the system, then we need to make it easy for people to custody their own assets. In addition to that, now at Casa, we're also working on the forefront of the medium of exchange side of things with Lightning Network, where that is so cutting edge that people who are using the Lightning Network are finding failures on a regular basis. And so, like I said, we're failing forward on that side of things, where we're constantly pushing the boundaries of what can be done with the technology so that we break it and we rebuild it, make it stronger, and keep moving forward.
I suppose on the flip side of that, I love your vision of the failure as a means to move forward. It's a personal philosophy I agree with, and I can see that working so well in this sphere. But I suppose looking from that mass adoption perspective, so many people say, you're talking about waves of adoption before, that the institutions are the next wave. And obviously, when they hear about failures in the system, they get afraid. They say, look at this thing, it's clearly not ready yet. We don't want to move into the space yet. Do you think that's a problem, or do you think it's better to have the system and all its kinks fully worked out before we start getting that next big wave of adoption in?
It's complicated because From a perspective of software, software is never finished. There will always be things to improve. The existing financial system is by no means perfect. There are failures all throughout the existing financial system. So I think that really what it comes down to is like what rate of failures and what level of criticality of failures are amenable to certain level of new adopters. And so, institutional investors are going to probably be more comfortable with certain types of failures and failure rates than the average retail mainstream consumer. And that's why we end up with these waves of adoption is we ratchet up the usability and security and safety of the system to a point that it becomes accessible to a certain type of new user. They adopt it, then we break a bunch of stuff that we didn't think about, and then the cycle repeats.
I want to touch on that point that you raised as well, talking about the private key and making self-custody a more accessible solution, because there are many inside the industry now that are trying to move away from that self-custody model and have custodial services that provide bank-like services, particularly for holding onto crypto, various services. I'm talking BlockFi, Celsius Network, any of those sort of guys that are working in that space. Do you see that as counter to the sort of cryptocurrency movement, or do you think you can have both a self-custody and external custodial system work in parallel?
The most important thing, I think, is freedom of choice. And with the traditional financial system, you don't really have the choice to store all of your money, at home under your mattress. It's just not a logical alternative. Now, there will be custody solutions, and some of those will be able to offer things that self-custody won't be able to do. On the other hand, I think that what we're able to do at CASA is to try to find a balancing act, where we know that there are reasons why banks exist. Like, banks do provide certain services and features that a lot of people want. So at CASA, we're trying to provide services that help people help themselves. So we provide the software that gives people the guidance and the best practices for how to set up and secure their funds, but we also provide this white glove level of concierge service that is almost like having your own private banker. The difference being we never actually control your money, but we help you control your money.
An empowering solution, and as you say, giving people that choice to decide how they want to move forward. Jameson, I want to thank you so much for speaking to us at BLOCKTV today.
Thanks for having me.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.